is Mark Sargent. I serve as the provost of Westmont College. And on behalf of the college and the Westmont Foundation, we're delighted that you are here to enjoy tonight's lecture. This is an opportunity, these downtown lectures are an opportunity for Westmont to really share with the Santa Barbara community some of the thought and research of our faculty. It's always a delight for me to introduce our speakers. For those of you that are interested in the full series, there's some nice brochures at the back. You might want to grab them. It's interesting, we're featuring 4 professors this year. Paul Willis, who spoke earlier, Meredith Whitney, who I will introduce briefly, Jim Taylor, and Amanda Sparkman. Jim will be speaking on civility in these turbulent times, and Amanda will be speaking on a changing climate and the biodiversity. And all 4 of them are here today. So it's great to have our 4 lecturers in attendance. It's a special delight for me to introduce to you Dr. Meredith Whitney. It's a special delight for me because she was a student at Gordon College in Massachusetts, where I used to serve as provost. So she was a student when I was a faculty member provost. And I remember her at that time proposing an individualized major. She created her own major, and it's just an example of the kind of initiative and creativity that she has continued to bring to her work. After Gordon, she went ahead and pursued a master's degree and a doctorate in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. And she specialized in gender, religion, culture, and social theory. Those interests took her to South Africa, where she has been studying the relationships between religion and different forms of social inequity. And she's particularly interested in how organizations form responses to social issues. Last year, she got a very prestigious fellowship from the Global Religion Research Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and had an opportunity to devote the year to working on a new book, which she is finishing, called Faith and the Fragility of Justice: Religious Responses to Gender-Based Violence in South Africa. This is a historical study that investigates how faith-based non-government organizations in South Africa have resisted apartheid and have addressed gender-based violence in that country. In my many conversations with Meredith over the years, I've always been impressed by how she remains committed to exploring difficult moral questions and making efforts to discern our ethical responsibilities. And I think she does it admirably without the ideological rancor that we often hear at our times. And she does it with a desire to listen and understand multiple viewpoints before rushing to judgment, but always with a reminder that inaction and silence are not solutions. I look forward to hearing her comments this evening. She's really put in a hard day's labor. She taught 3 classes today, and this is her 4th. So welcome, Dr. Meredith Whitney.
Well, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight, and I'm particularly grateful to all of you who have made the time to be here. I also want to extend particular thanks to the Westmont Foundation for the vision and the resources that make these talks possible, to my student research assistant, Joy Hahn, who helped to compile a helpful background for this talk, and again to Provost Mark Sargent for the role that you have played in my own academic journey since the time I was a college student through the present, and for the role that you play in facilitating these talks. So thank you all. It is right and good that people, myself included, have been a little tripped up about the title of this talk. We even have some different versions circulating. The posters on campus advertise the talk as making sense of a movement, while the press release and emails that have circulated to announce it have included my initial intent to make sense of a moment. This editorial glitch that was fully my responsibility made me cringe at first because it's hard to quiet my inner perfectionist editor. But I actually think that this is the perfect place to start. In a recent TED Talk, activist Tarana Burke, the original founder of the Me Too movement, affirmed her view that Me Too should be more than just a moment of reckoning. It is also a movement. and it is a movement particularly for people who have experienced sexual assault. In 2006, Burke started the Me Too movement to call attention to the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in our society and to build connections and empathy among survivors. The simple declaration that a person experiencing sexual abuse is not alone can be very powerful. Indeed, it can be so powerful that when actress Alyssa Milano called for all women who have ever been sexually harassed and assaulted to write Me Too and used the hashtag on Twitter as allegations against Harvey Weinstein were emerging in October 2017, the hashtag went viral. And yet, we also live in a moment where the movement is contested. It has been contested from within as people are continuing to advocate for greater attention to the lives of the not rich and famous, for instance, and it has faced contestation from without, as, for instance, politicians have condemned it for frightening parents of boys in particular, and businessmen have reported feeling hesitant to mentor women for fear of accusation. So in this talk, I want to convince you that we are in a moment that has implications for a movement. We should listen well to the voice of the founder of this movement and not downplay its social and political consequences, nor think that if the moment fades, the issues will too. But at the same time, my talk tonight is going to focus on some of the features of the institutional and cultural moment in which we find ourselves. I think it is helpful to examine the dynamics of our present situation in order to best address, first and foremost, the needs of survivors, which has always been Burke's aim, and also to consider how we could better set up our institutions in ways that can prevent abuse from happening and adequately to address it if it does. One of the gifts and burdens of thinking sociologically about issues that matter is that we often engage in issues that are deeply personal at the same time that they are also social. And this is certainly true of the Me Too moment and movement. I recognize that in the room tonight, we may have people who have experienced assault and harassment. We may have people who have reported those experiences and those who have never disclosed their experience to anyone else. We may have people whose job has involved receiving and responding to complaints. We may have people who have engaged in some of the kinds of actions that have recently come under scrutiny. We may have people who were taken aback by hearing allegations, as well as those for whom these narratives are all too familiar, and on and on. So I want to acknowledge from the beginning that depending on our experiences and views of the world, we likely approach this topic in quite different ways from one another. And I also, though, want to adjust the lens through which we view and understand the Me Too moment and movement, focusing our attention on the institutional and cultural factors that contribute to our current moment can help us to recognize how our own stories and experiences, important as they are also part of something bigger than ourselves. This is not to invalidate or diminish our experiences, but to recognize, as sociologist C. Wright Mills put it, that our personal troubles are also public issues, and that our own biographies intersect with the course of history. To make sense of this, I'm going to use the term institution in a specific sense tonight to help to explain how we are shaped by and immersed in social realities that can inform our individual actions and behaviors. So what is an institution? This is one of the things I taught on today. So I'm going to use a definition from political economist Douglas North, who wrote a famous book about this on institutions and institutional change, in which he suggested that at the most basic level, institutions are our rules of the game. They can inform formal and legal rules, and they can involve informal social norms. They are fundamentally about patterns that exist outside of us, but that shape and govern our lives. Sociologists Liz Clemens and James Cook have also pointed out that institutions are entities that both constrain the kinds of actions that are possible for us, as they also provide models for how we are to move in the world. So I'm going to draw on this understanding of institutions to point out that there are various rules of the game involving social expectations, processes, formal and informal dynamics, and both constraints and models that are essential for us to grapple with if we are going to make good sense of the Me Too moment and movement. My goal tonight is to convince you that we live in a moment that has particular features and that we need to make sense of that moment. And I hope that better understanding the institutional and cultural features of this moment will point us to consider how individual stories and experiences are also caught up in forces much bigger than ourselves. This in turn can have implications for how each of us chooses to move in the world in ways that better promote the flourishing of our neighbors and ourselves. So part of the dynamic of our particular moment is that there have been public and widely covered accounts of a wide range of allegations across a number of social institutions and organizations. I'm going to talk about 4 main contexts. These cases, I think, can help us to see some of the patterns of institutional and cultural factors that matter most. Other cases could likely help us to see the significance of other cultural and institutional dimensions, and we can certainly consider that in the question and answer time. So I'm going to focus first on the film and media industries. This is where we saw the Me Too hashtag go viral on Twitter as actress Alyssa Milano used the hashtag in response to the allegations against Harvey Weinstein. So this case has its own features that relate to Weinstein in particular, but it also reflects the sense of ubiquity of experiences of harassment and in some cases assault. While other allegations had been made against other prominent people that made news headlines in recent years, this incident seems to have been a major catalyst for a wave of allegations. And in Weinstein's case, it's notable partly for the sheer volume of allegations that have emerged. So what are the features of the problem in this context? More than 80 women have made allegations against Weinstein in particular that go back over a period of 4 decades, ranging from harassment to assault. There seems to be a sense of at least some people who had heard rumors of inappropriate behavior for years. So this wasn't a new issue to many people, though to some people the extent of the allegations has indeed been shocking. One key institutional factor here has been the role of non-disclosure agreements, people who knew things were legally bound not to disclose. There's some evidence that Weinstein used these as tools to keep people from talking, and that when some people started to pursue cases against him, he wielded considerable influence to prevent the stories from coming out. So we're seeing the significance of non-disclosure agreements in other cases too. For instance, in the wake of the controversy over Matt Lauer, NBC Universal just announced recently, in the last few weeks I think, that it will allow women with allegations of assault to go back to the company, and the women will be released from what the company calls a perceived obligation that they were under to not disclose. As with complaints made against the Weinstein Company, NBC Universal has also been accused of covering up or suppressing allegations. So in this case, the primary mechanism for response and possible resolution has involved both internal organizational processes and in some cases external legal processes. In terms of the internal or industry-related, NBC Universal fired Matt Lauer after conducting an internal investigation. For Weinstein, the Weinstein Company then fired him, and various guilds and industry entities have banned him. In this case, also, we've seen civil and criminal charges filed in Weinstein's case in particular, and there's been a settlement in part of the civil case, but it looks as though they're moving forward with criminal rape charges, which will proceed in January, and he's pled not guilty to those charges. So we'll have to wait and see what kind of legal process unfolds in this case. One of the main institutional dynamics that is at work here, that's true in all of the cases I'll talk about tonight, is that there are particular features of the industry more generally that have mattered for the way that allegations of abuse and assault have emerged and been handled. Rumors of alleged misconduct circulated for years, but the industry tends to work in ways that suppress allegations, with influential people having considerable sway over other people's careers. Some critics have charged that Hollywood is a faux liberal institution, F-A-U-X, fake liberal institution, one that touts itself as being progressive when in reality the brokenness and exploitative practices run very deep. Whatever we might think of that particular claim, it has become clear that this is not just a case of individual people, but it's also about systems that protect some and make others more vulnerable. The second context to consider is politics. Here I have in mind a range of things, including the Access Hollywood tape of then-candidate Trump bragging about grabbing women's bodies that was released in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, to photos and accounts of inappropriate misconduct by people like Al Franken, to Christine Blasey Ford's allegation of assault against then-nominee Brett Kavanaugh, to Representative Katie Hill, who resigned just a few weeks ago, and of course there are many instances in addition to these. The problem here, again, covers a range of allegations from inappropriate relationships to harassment to assault. Some of the alleged behaviors occurred quite recently, while others are alleged to have occurred decades ago. Many allegations have been found credible and resulted in the resignation of officials, while others remain hotly contested, with, in some cases, the alleged perpetrators continuing to occupy high positions of power. While there are a number of factors that matter in considering these dynamics, it's important to think about how these varied allegations and responses show the power and fragility of political mechanisms for resolution. For instance, some interpret the election of Trump and confirmation of Kavanaugh to be signs or proof of their innocence, while to others these political outcomes show the brokenness of the system. We've seen the emergence of social movements and political protests against the political apparatuses. And new congressional ethics policies were a factor in the resignation recently of Katie Hill. Similar to what we see in the industry of film and media, using mechanisms from within, for good or ill, the allegations here are responded to using the tools available in this particular institutional realm, through political maneuverings and processes and the emergence of social movements and protests. These cases also point to the increased politicization of the Me Too movement. I'm thinking particularly here of Christine Blasey Ford's allegations and the shift that seemed to occur in this case to increased polarization regarding allegations. And her case in particular also highlights the possible cost of coming forward with allegations, including death threats. As these cases highlight the increased polarization and politicization around Me Too, they also share in common with Hollywood a sense of ubiquity, as, for instance, the allegations are spanning the ideological and political spectrum. While I'm sure we have varied opinions about the particulars of these varied cases, and certainly would disagree about the effectiveness of these mechanisms for response, my main point here is that as the problems have emerged from within and related to a political context, so too, to a large degree, the primary mechanisms for the response are operating within and using the tools of that context. From these two secular institutions, I'm going to pivot now to consider cases that have emerged in the religious sphere, specifically the Roman Catholic Church and Evangelical Protestantism. Within the Roman Catholic context, we can think of recent reports published in Pennsylvania in 2018 and a new one from Colorado that was published or disseminated just in the past few weeks. Again, these are patterns that are alleged to go back years, with various waves of other reports already having been disseminated. The problem here again involves a range of activities. Child sexual abuse has been the focus of a number of these reports, but reports are also including what appear to be extensive cover-ups by key leaders, as well as recognizing that the abuse of minors is only one dimension of the problem. We can see, for instance, emergence or renewed attention to stories of historical and contemporary rape of nuns, the emergence of a #NunsToo hashtag in response to the church covering up reporting of allegations, and the abuse in some instances of adult seminarians. We see an interesting range of proposed mechanisms for resolution of the issues, ranging from a former priest writing in The Atlantic about the need to abolish the priesthood altogether, to what we are seeing in our current moment with the defrocking of Cardinal McCarrick, who is found to have engaged in systematic abuse and moved up the hierarchy regardless. We're also seeing some new legal responses with, for instance, New York State courts allowing people to file lawsuits even if cases had expired under old statute of limitation laws. As with the other institutions, the particular features of this social institution matter, both for the ways that alleged behaviors happened and for the possible mechanisms of response. There have certainly been these external legal mechanisms at work, while there are also important internal mechanisms at work. For instance, Pope Francis recently issued new regulations that make it mandatory for Roman Catholic clergy to report cases of clerical sexual abuse and cover-ups to the church. For the first time, it's not up to an individual person's discretion, but is mandatory that it is disclosed, and the regulations also provide for measures when bishops are the ones who are accused of abuse. So the Catholic hierarchical system has been critiqued for the way the structure has helped to protect abusers and failed adequately to follow up on allegations or support victims who came forward. At the same time, the regulations that Pope Francis is inaugurating are a way that the hierarchy itself could potentially be a mechanism for addressing some of these issues. Again, whether or not we think this is adequate or the best path forward, the point is that the institution is drawing on the resources it has as much as it is responding to external criticisms. Fourth, I'm going to consider the case of U.S. evangelicalism. Here we've seen allegations emerge against prominent megachurch and denominational leaders, including Bill Hybels of Willow Creek Church in Chicago and Andy Savage of High Point in Tennessee. Southern Baptist icon Paige Patterson was forced out of his position after reports circulated of mishandled cases of rape and damaging advice to abuse victims. And recent reports of broader patterns of abuse have also emerged from contexts like the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. In these various cases, the alleged behavior ranges from inappropriate relationships and behavior with women, that was true in Hybels' case, including staff members, to assault of minors in Savage's case, to mishandled allegations of rape and problematic responses to abused women in Patterson's case. And here again, we see people drawing on the resources available to them from within their particular organizational and institutional domains to respond to the allegations. There have been mostly internal investigations and resignations from positions of leadership. Legal options are limited in cases like Savage's due to statute of limitations. In the case of Willow Creek, the entire board of elders and both Hybels and the two pastors he had chosen as his successors have resigned. An external investigation in that case found the allegations credible. One of the cultural features here is a long-standing debate about gender roles. Leaders like John Piper have recently suggested that the solution to these problems is to return to traditional masculinity and to emphasize the protection of women by men. Evangelical feminists, on the other hand, suggest that the answer is to rectify power imbalances and to actually attend to the stories of women and recognize that abused women are sitting in the pew. Both are saying that theirs is the right perspective because it's what the Bible teaches. Both have also been constrained by the fact that they've been in a gender debate with one another. Evangelical feminists have been constrained because they've been associated with secular feminism, even as they're trying to assert that theirs is the right evangelical approach. And gender traditionalists, or complementarians, for those of us familiar with that debate, because they have occupied a defensive posture, and this means that they have had a much more difficult time centering women's experiences. So here too, the particular institutional and cultural features are significant. Public acknowledgments by pastors of some misconduct and declarations of their repentance from sin were initially met with standing ovations in their congregations. The Southern Baptist Convention focused on sexual abuse during its most recent convention and convened panels to address the reports. And in just the last few weeks, Andy Savage has filed paperwork to start a new church. Jules Woodson, who was a minor when he engaged in inappropriate sexual relationship with her as her youth pastor, tweeted, "Devastating news. My abuser is back in the pulpit." So let me briefly zoom out from these individual cases and point to some of the similarities and differences we're seeing here. Recall that definition I gave you at the beginning about institutions. What are the rules of the game that have existed here, and how are we seeing patterns both of constraint and models of behavior in these cases? One of the key factors we see is that there is a range of allegations of the types of behavior within and across these varied social institutions. This may seem like an obvious statement to make, but I think it's important. Inappropriate comments are not the same thing as rape, and it seems important to be able to distinguish among the types of alleged actions. At the same time, calling assault sexual misconduct does not adequately or accurately acknowledge the extent of the actions. The models of behavior that have existed in these institutions are being challenged, and time will tell if the institutions themselves are able to adapt and adopt new models for behavior. There also seems to be a common thread underlying these various allegations, and that is, with few exceptions, we're talking about men in positions of power using those positions to influence others. Again, this might seem obvious, but I think this is important. It raises all sorts of questions about how people in positions of authority and power can use their influence for good or for ill. If the rules of the game have involved a lack of attention to power differences, and if fundamentally the rules are based on exploiting people, the rules may need to change. We also can see that there are certain organizational and institutional processes that can either help or hinder. In all of these cases, people, again, are tending to draw on the resources and mechanisms that are already available to them. Clemens and Cook, who I mentioned earlier, describe the ways in which institutions provide scripts for us to follow. We're seeing the ways in which the available scripts we've been drawing on may be changing. These scripts and processes have hindered and suppressed, like the case of non-disclosure agreements, but we can also see some ways they could potentially either hinder or help, like the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which clearly both has suppressed patterns of abuse, but also with the new regulations has at least the potential to carry substantial weight and influence. Likewise, the evangelical script that emphasizes the power of conversion and turning away from sin may be helpful to a certain degree, but perhaps might also be masking attention to the full resolution of the problem, as in the case of Jules Woodson and Andy Savage. Fourth, ideologies matter, but in different ways. So these cultural scripts seem to be important for thinking about the role of ideology in these various cases. It's interesting sociologically that we are seeing ideologically progressive and conservative institutions involved in this. We can see the power of other kinds of ideology in the secular institutions, but in the case of the religious organizations, this may be particularly clear. For instance, Catholic teachings on priestly authority and celibacy versus the evangelical teachings on gender roles highlight the impact of different kinds of ideology on the process of experiencing and responding to allegations of abuse. So given these patterns of similarity and difference in the variety of institutional contexts and mechanisms for response, I want to turn now to consider the broader and deeper institutional and cultural realities that are shaping our current moment, and again focus on four main factors that I think are shaping some of these more localized institutional realities. The first is that we're seeing a focus on prominent people. One of the criticisms that's emerged in relation to the movement itself is that it had been initiated by an activist woman of color 10 years before a famous actress tweeted about Harvey Weinstein. Tarana Burke and others have consistently pointed out that the movement started to allow survivors to find connection and understanding and to courageously acknowledge their own experiences. So we need to keep considering whose stories are perceived to be most valuable and worthy of reporting. Just because narratives about famous people are emerging now doesn't mean that these kind of actions aren't happening among the not rich and famous. And even my own portrayal of these issues tonight could be seen as problematic, as I've tended to focus more on those accused of inappropriate and in some cases criminal behavior rather than on the survivors. At the same time, it does seem significant that people whom we recognize to be powerful and influential are facing more scrutiny and possibly more accountability than they have had in the past. To at least a certain degree, the power and privilege that some prominent people have wielded in damaging ways is being exposed. This leaves us with the question of how power might be used in different ways to promote flourishing rather than exploitation, whether we're talking about famous and socially prominent people or our everyday encounters that can involve power imbalances. The second point relates to this first one about how and when and about whom stories and responses emerge. I think we need to grapple with the role of social media and technology. It's clear that we live in a moment in which information is almost instantly available. Depending on which news source we read or listen to, we can be receiving and constructing completely different ideas about what's true and what's real. One short tweet can be shared and debated within seconds, and arguably this is not the most effective way to engage in thoughtful, reasonable, and careful discussion of complex and often emotionally difficult issues. But at the same time, it has also proved to be an incredibly effective tool for mobilizing people and raising awareness. Here again, similar to the particular institutional dynamics I pointed to in the different cases, there's a dynamic of both facilitating and constraining responses that I think we would do well to consider and continue to grapple with. Third, we're seeing the importance of healthy or unhealthy organizational structures. This is true for the problem itself in terms of the mechanisms in place to allow allegations to be made and for the kinds of responses that organizations can make. I've already highlighted the role of mechanisms like non-disclosure agreements, which we know go well beyond not sharing trade secrets, to preventing people who have experienced harassment from voicing their stories. We've also seen the role of internal versus external investigations into allegations, and the reality is that the choice that organizations are able to make around this can have a lot to do with the effective responses. Conducting investigations well seems imperative. Often outside entities can do this more effectively if they can be truly neutral. Related to this, The Atlantic recently published an interesting piece about the conflicting status of human resources offices because they are both the entity charged with receiving and responding to complaints, and they function to help prevent lawsuits from being filed against the organization or corporation. There are competing interests involved sometimes in the processes of investigation and resolution of allegations. It also seems clear that one of the dynamics in some of these cases is that there were simply not clear enough policies in place for allegations to be investigated, and sometimes good policies were not well executed. Whether because, for instance, people actively stonewalled those attempting to make allegations, or powerful people were abusing minors who were then not taken seriously when they did come forward, there are clear patterns of inadequate or improperly executed policies ranging back a number of years, suggesting that there could be better mechanisms implemented for ensuring a healthier climate. And this is actually one of the key concrete things that has emerged in this moment as workplaces are working to ensure that they have better and healthier climates and procedures. Finally, the fourth institutional and cultural factor that seems critical here is the question of gender, in terms specifically of the kind of attitudes and beliefs we hold around gender, as well as the representation and position of men and women in the varied contexts where we're seeing these issues emerge. Here I want to draw on the work of sociologist Paula England, who has studied gender inequality in labor markets, and Cecilia Ridgway, who examines why gender inequality persists in the modern world. England wrote an influential piece called The Gender Revolution, Uneven and Stalled, in which she argued that competing cultural beliefs, one stressing a kind of gender egalitarianism that works well with American individualism, and the other, stressing essentialist gendered capacities, have worked together to shape the movement of some women into certain kinds of professions that have been closed off to them in the past, but at the same time limiting other women from moving up in their professions and limiting men from shifting into traditionally female jobs. The structure of our occupations is also linked to our cultural ideas about gender. Cecilia Ridgway argued that one of the key mechanisms sustaining persisting gender inequality has to do with the beliefs that we have about gender. And she draws on social psychology to argue that our beliefs about gender difference often sustain beliefs about status inequality. In other words, in our current context, it is difficult to not connect beliefs about difference into beliefs that also sustain hierarchy and inequality. There are many other important factors that are involved in these cultural mechanisms having to do with the structure of our economy, political structures, and a host of other factors. But I'm going to land on this emphasis on gender itself as its own distinct and important facet of social life, because I think this is crucial for understanding how we might both make sense of the current moment we're in and consider what movements are necessary from this moment. We know, for instance, that women remain underrepresented in political offices, upper management positions, and religious hierarchies. To the extent that we have cultural beliefs that continue to present these patterned realities as individually rooted and as about essential or natural capacities based on gender, we may continue to expect the kind of power imbalances that have existed that promote the kinds of exploitation and abuse of power that both women and men today are currently protesting in the Me Too movement. So where do we go from here? I want to close the talk tonight by considering some of the implications of these ideas for ourselves in whatever context we find ourselves inhabiting, and then we'll move to a question and answer time. I'll frame this in a way that should resonate with my wonderful students who are in the room tonight, as this is a question we often pose in my classes. What kind of posture do we want to adopt, and what is most helpful? We know as sociologists that our cultural ideas have embodied realities, that we practice as much as we think things, and so I use this term posture intentionally to imply that responding to this particular issue that matters requires more than just thinking or believing the right or most helpful things. It's also about ourselves as practicing active creatures who are embedded in and responding to particular institutional realities. So, what posture might we adopt? Practically speaking, one of the most important things seems to be to adopt a posture that is oriented to the survivor. This is something that the Me Too movement has insisted upon from the beginning, and I fully recognize that it can make some of us uncomfortable and raise some prickly questions, but it is essential. It is essential partly because we know that contrary to what can be portrayed in various news media, it actually remains quite rare to report allegations, especially of assault, and that it is even more rare for people to make false reports or allegations. It is also essential because we are continuing to grow in our awareness and understanding of the costs to people who make allegations, ranging from economic to spiritual to social. Responding well to this issue that matters requires that we understand the dynamics of abuse and assault, that we not re-traumatize those who are sharing their experiences, and that we find ways to be in companionship and solidarity. It is also helpful to adopt a posture that remains committed to truth and facts. The process of investigating allegations matters for both the accusing and the accused. It also matters for those of us who may never be in either one of those positions. In our ever-shifting cultural terrain that too easily and quickly vilifies, pretends there are no reliable facts, asserts that evidence is always questionable, etc., it is important to reclaim a posture of fairness, belief in facts and evidence, and care for right process. This is important for all involved in these kinds of situations, whether accusing or accused. Implied in both of these is the importance of a posture of listening well. Listening well even to what is difficult to take in and understand can change us. From a Christian perspective, I think it could behoove us to engage in some practices of prophetic lament and to reclaim a robust notion both of the inherent dignity of all creatures and of a notion of sin that perceives its impact not only on individuals but also institutions. In the confession of sin that my own church prays frequently, we acknowledge that we have sinned by the things we have done and left undone, acknowledging where we were not paying attention where we should have, that we should act where we have failed to do so, that we have acted in ways we should not have. All of these seem like important components of a posture to this moment that could be helpful. Ultimately, finding ways to engage in the restoration of healthier relationships and systems that promote the flourishing of all people are healthy and necessary steps to take if we are to fully grapple with this moment. And finally, because I'm such a good sociologist, I want to leave us where I started. Our individual lives and experiences do matter, and so do the institutions that we work together to both create and sometimes to change. Whether we think of this as a moment or a movement, it is clear that there are factors beyond ourselves that are shaping our experiences and our perceptions. But at the same time, we are society, we create institutions, and we know that institutions can change to promote flourishing rather than exploitation. As we continue to make sense of this moment, my hope is that we also find ways to act. Thank you.